So we're going to talk now. We'll move on to discussion 20, and in discussion 20, the issue is the resurrection of the bodily resurrection and the nature of the hereafter. Whether the hereafter is physical or bodily, in the way that it's described, right, by the Quran. Because the Falasifa deny the resurrection of bodies, and they deny bodily pleasures and pains in the hereafter. And they claim that these are only metaphors that revelation uses to appeal to the understanding of the masses, right? The awam, is it the public?
Yeah. What?
So,
Awam.
huh?
لا يعني عامة.
Awam?
Yeah.
Got to say it correctly.
Yeah.
Awam. Yeah. So, in truth, they claim there is only the immaterial soul which survives death. And the pleasures and pains in the afterlife are intellectual and spiritual pleasures only, and not bodily pleasures, right? So these descriptions of fire and gardens and stuff are just metaphorical ways to express something which people cannot actually imagine because, right, it's beyond anything that people have experienced because of the fact that it's a purely spiritual reality, right? So the whole notion for the philosophers, for the Falasifa, right, is that you kind of purify your soul through contemplation of the intelligibles, through philosophy, right? Because the idea here is that your intellect and the grasping of intelligibles, the grasping of the forms of things, is actually your access to the truth, right, of things. And through the practice of this contemplation, kind of purify your soul from bodily attachments, right? And the more this is done, the more you can sort of liberate yourself or purify yourself from bodily attachments. Because of the fact that the body is something which is material and which is temporal and which will decay, but the soul is eternal and the intelligibles are eternal, right? Or at least to say the intelligibles are eternal and the forms are eternal. So if your soul gets attached to those through contemplation, it will also remain, right? But if your soul is attached to the body through chasing after your lusts and desires and so forth, then it will go the way of the body. So that when you die, right, you will be torn from the body, right? And you'll feel the pain the more you're attached to it, right? But the more you're attached to the intelligible, then you will feel pleasure and happiness because you'll be enjoying that, right? And this has nothing to do with the bodily pleasures and pains, but it's something that we haven't experienced. So their claim here is that the descriptions of paradise and hell that are physical in nature are merely metaphorical, right? Okay. So Ghazali, he agrees that the soul is immaterial and that there are spiritual pleasures and pains in the hereafter. But he believes that bodies are also resurrected and there are also bodily pleasures and pains in the hereafter, just as Revelation describes, right? So he's not denying that there's this spiritual reality. He's not denying that the soul is immaterial, yeah? But he is objecting to their denial of the bodily pleasures and pains. He says there can be both, and there's both. There's this sort of spiritual happiness of being near to God, and there's this spiritual suffering of being separated from God in Jahannam, right? And there's also the physical pleasures and pains that the Quran describes. Both of them are the keys, okay? And then, importantly, he says, since it's not impossible, he claims it's not impossible for, right, the body to be resurrected and to experience these things in the hereafter, then it's obligatory to believe in that because that's what Revelation tells us. So the whole idea here is, for him, is a rule of interpretation, right? Tawil, we say tawil. For Ghazali, tawil is sometimes necessary, and other times it is forbidden, right? It's forbidden when there's no demonstrative logical proof that the literal interpretation is impossible. So, for example, the Falasifa, claim in defense of themselves that the reports in Revelation of a bodily hereafter are like the anthropomorphic descriptions of God, right? So it says, Allah says in the Quran, He talks about His hand, or His shin, or His face, or things like this, right? And the philosophers say, hey, we know that God can't have a body, and so therefore, right, God doesn't have a body, so therefore we have to interpret these as metaphorical, right? God doesn't have a hand like this hand, or a face, like in a literal sense, yeah? And Ghazali rejects that because he says they're very different. The first thing that he says is different is that the anthropomorphic utterances that are in the Quran can be interpreted figuratively, he says, in accordance with the custom of Arabic language and how it uses metaphor, right? So I guess the idea here is he'll be saying, in Arabic, when we talk about a hand, sometimes something is between your hands, right? They say, it means it's within your power, right? So there is a sort of, in the custom of Arabic language, the use of the hand in a metaphor in that way. Given that that's the case, to use the image of hand in a metaphor for that is not misleading because that's actually part of the language, right? But if we use a language in a metaphorical way, which is not in accord with the customary use of language, then our use of metaphor is not clarifying or explanatory. It's more like it's misleading, right? So, and according to what he says, the descriptions of the hereafter are not, for example, so have Arabs used the term hand to understand the concept of power? You'll say yes, in Arabic language that's the case. But in Arabic language they use the concept of gardens with rivers flowing underneath to represent the concept of contemplation of the intellect and, freedom from bodily pleasures. Well, that doesn't seem really it fits as well, right? It's almost opposite, yeah? So that would be, in his case, that would be as if God's misleading because he's actually using the very opposite image, right, to express what he supposedly intends. Mm-hmm. So this has to do with the relation to language. And being a non-Arabic speaking philosopher, I don't have any really way to, let's say, evaluate that, right? Other than it does seem to be not just in Arabic, but in any language, right? It's in English that when we talk about something is in your hands, you don't have to be an Arabic speaker to sort of understand that metaphorically. This is in your hands. It means it's in your power, right? Whereas, we don't normally even in English, express the idea of, liberation from the attachments of the body by images of bodily attachments, right? This is something a little bit different, right? So, anyway, it may have to do with language in general, and it may be the case that all languages have a similar kind of sort of system of metaphor. I would think that's probably the case. Right? This is a separate issue. The most important thing for us is this issue, that he says rational proof has shown that the literal truth of the anthropomorphic descriptions of God is impossible. Right? We know by a demonstrative proof with logical certainty, that God has no body. He's not a body, right? So that he doesn't have a bodily hand or a bodily face or bodily shin. Both kinds of proof. Actually, there's direct proof from the text of the Quran because it'll say that there's nothing like him. And then rational proof also, which from the basic premise that God, for example, is not caused, but he's the cause of everything else, but nothing created God. Anything that has a body will consist of parts, because all bodies consist of parts, and those parts have to be put together by something else. So that means if God had a body, he would be something which is put together by something else, right? This is in basic terms, the proof there that God doesn't have a body, and there are others, right? So, but in any case, the idea here is that rational proof has shown that it cannot literally be true that God has a hand, for example. But there's no rational demonstrative proof that bodies can't be resurrected, or that in the hereafter bodily pleasures and pains are impossible. And so since that's the case, right, we have to interpret the anthropomorphic descriptions of God figuratively, but we are forbidden from interpreting the descriptions of paradise, right, and hell figuratively, because there's no compelling reason to do so. And if there's no reason to, then we should not. That doesn't mean to say that there are also not figurative meanings. There can be figurative meanings, but the problem is when we want to deny the literal meaning. You can only deny the truth of the literal meaning or the apparent meaning when there's absolute proof that it's impossible that the literal meaning is true. Everybody okay?
Just don't understand this part that says reports and revelation of what do they hereafter. Like, I know the part about the description of God and
Right.
the anthropo of this word, but the first line, like, what's the connection between the bodily hereafter and the description?
Oh, so what they're saying is that, okay, when the Quran says that paradise has, rivers and gardens and, all the other good stuff, right?
Yeah.
So this is like the anthropomorphic descriptions. So since we interpret the anthropomorphic descriptions figuratively, we also can interpret the descriptions of the hereafter figuratively,
Okay.
right? Ghazali's objection is that, well, we do interpret the anthropomorphic descriptions figuratively because we have rational logical proof that their literal sense cannot be true. But there's no such proof that the literal sense of the descriptions of the hereafter cannot be literally true, right? And since there is no such proof, that means it's possible, and since it's possible, there's no reason not to believe in the apparent literal meaning. So we should believe in the apparent literal meaning. Right? In other words, if the philosophers want to say that this can't be true, they have to bring a proof. They don't have a proof, right? Okay. So then, well, they do say they have a proof, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Right? Ghazali then considers the proof, and the proof is very interesting. So they say, right, if there were bodily resurrection, and that's basically what we're going to be focusing on, is the resurrection of bodies, right? If there was bodily resurrection, then it could only happen in three different ways. So there's three different ways to conceive what would go on in such a process, right? The first, we can call it the process of reconstructing a quantitatively identical body, which is the materialist version, okay? So on this view, there's no substantial soul, which is independent of the body. And this was a widespread belief among the theologians until now and before Ghazali, right? That there's no independent soul from the body. Instead, basically, the human being, they said, is a living body, right? God creates the body, and then He creates life in the body. But the life is not something independent of the body, right? When the body is destroyed, the life is also destroyed. There's no immaterial soul that leaves the body or separate from the body. You're just your body, and you're alive. And then you will die, and that's it. And then God will make you again, right? And He will make your body again and put life in it again, and there you will be. That was a view. This was a materialist view. I mean, they didn't have an idea of an immaterial soul. They thought the soul was kind of an atom or a piece of the body. And some people thought the soul was part of your tailbone, because there's a hadith that talks about everybody's tailbone would be left over or something like that, right?
Okay, when God gives humans a soul, is it like a new one because it's a new life, or it's the old soul that gets...
That's the key question that they're going to have, the philosopher. You see? But what we just need to understand now is the difference between saying the soul is a substance or saying the soul is an accident. Because remember, a substance is something that exists independently. So if on this view, the soul is an accident of the body, like the color red is an accident of the apple. And if the apple doesn't exist, its redness doesn't exist either, right? Yeah, it's a part of or a feature of or an attribute of the substance, right? So the soul is not something that exists independently. So in that case, what happens with resurrection, as we said, was that the body will be returned, right? God will recreate the body and put life in it. Now, there are two ways to think about this, the philosophers say. One is that the body ceases to exist altogether. It just completely doesn't exist, is annihilated. And then, in resurrection, God brings it back to existence and puts the life back in it. Right? And another way is that what God does on the resurrection is collects the matter that was the body and then puts it back together into the body. So there's basically two different ways of understanding the annihilation of the body. One is that here's the person, and then they just completely cease to exist. But the philosophers say, on the other hand, we can understand that the body consists of some matter. And when the body ceases to exist, what happens is the matter just turns into a different form. So the person is in the grave, and then their body, decays and turns into soil or earth, right? Which then becomes, part of a plant, right? And so forth and so on. So the matter keeps getting cycled throughout, yeah? And so when the person dies, the body decays, but the matter of the body survives because matter isn't destroyed or created, right? In this view. And when the person is now, the resurrection of the body means God will collect that same matter into the body again, into the form of the body again. Okay? Like if you had a clay pot and then it got broken and then the clay turned into mud or whatever, and then God brings that same clay, which is now in the sort of basic form, right? And reshapes it back into the pot. Yeah? The pot stopped existing, but the clay that was made of continued to exist, and then it was reshaped again, right? So you got two different views about how this could happen. The body just ceases to exist, and then God brings it back into existence, or the body decays into its basic stuff, and that basic stuff continues to exist until the resurrection, when God brings that same basic stuff back together into the same form again of the person and puts life in it.
Cease as in disappear?
The first section?
Yeah.
The first one is it's just an idea of what it means to cease to exist. And that just means, just disappears, doesn't exist anymore at all. So we have, at the core here is a very basic, fundamental philosophical question about change and how to understand change. And one understanding of change is that things exist and then they cease to exist. And then new things come to exist. Another understanding of change is that nothing ceases to exist, right, or comes to exist anew. Rather, it's just matter changing from one form to another. You understand the two ideas here? So, in either case, either is possible with regard to these two positions, which are the positions that characterize this first alternative, right? This first alternative model of resurrection. That is that the soul is not a substantial thing that's independent of the body, right? And that's it. Yeah. And the human being is a living body. Yeah. As the soul is not a substantial thing, the human being is your body with the life, right? The life which is a feature of the body. When the body's gone, the life is gone. It doesn't remain in some other, right, substance. Okay. So the second way that they say resurrection could happen is the same, the return of the body to a the return of the soul to a quantitatively identical body.
But not like the first body. Completely different one?
No, they're both quantitatively identical bodies. So I should have clarified that. What we mean by quantitatively identical is it is the very same one.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the very same one.
The very same body.
But it's a new one.
That's the question, right? So the philosophers is going to be saying it can't be the same body, it has to be a new one, just like what you're saying. That's why they're going to say it's impossible. But now we're just characterizing the view, right? Yeah. So here we have, the soul is independent. When the body dies, the soul remains because it's a substance which exists independently of the body. But resurrection is the return of the soul, right? Which did not cease to exist. It returned, it stayed in the barzakh or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then it's returned to a body, which is the same body that's reconstructed. God brings back the same body, yeah? Recreates the same body that was there before, quantitatively identical, and then puts the soul into that body, right? So the only difference between the two views there is whether the soul is independent of the body or not. But they're the same with regard to the idea here that resurrection is the recreation of the exact same body. Yeah? Okay? The second one is different in that case. We have the return of the soul, right? The soul is an independent substance. But it's returned to not the exact same body, but a new body. A new body is recreated and the soul is put into that body. Now, the soul, which is actually the identity of the individual, right? The good thing about the idea of the substantial soul is that if we ask, well, what is it, so let's say here comes the resurrection of Munira, right? What makes it Munira? Well, we'll say it's the soul, because Munira is her soul. Munira's body is not her identity. The identity of a person or an individual is the soul. And if the soul continues to exist after the death of the body, and then that soul is put back into a body, if we want to ask the question, what makes it that same person, we can say it's the soul, right? Regardless of whether it's a new body or not, doesn't matter, because the person is the soul. Yeah? But the idea here is that for this resurrection, this model of resurrection, the body is not quantitatively identical. It's a different body, even if it's qualitatively similar, right? So let's say what's resurrected is a body. It looks just like your body, yeah? And it's just like your body in every way, but it's not the same one because, as you said, that one ceased to exist, and so you have a new one, a replica. A replica is not the same, right? A replica is another one, which is just like the first one. You see? So, in the first two views, right, we have it that it's not a replica body which is made, but instead the exact same body.
For the first case.
For the first and second. Yeah? Right? So what the first and second view have in common is that they believe that, what is recreated is the exact same body and not a new body, right? But what the second and the third view have in common is that the soul for them is a substance, is independent from the body. Okay?
Yeah.
Right. So everybody following the situation? Yeah. Okay. So what are the arguments? Well, Aisha has already, I think, forecast some of the argument that the Falasifa are going to make here, right? With regard to the first model, the first alternative, they say that it's impossible because, this is not a return. It can't be a return of the same person, but only the production of a new copy, right?
Yeah.
Why can't it be? Because they say once something truly ceases to exist, the very same numerically identical being cannot return, but only a qualitatively similar replica can return. Yeah? So, and then they talk about what it means, for example, to return. Because for a return, it has to be the same thing. So if I say, for example, Bob returned to town, right? That means that Bob was in town before, and he left town. And that same Bob came back to town. If it was a different Bob, if Bob left town and then got killed and buried, right? And then some scientist took and made a new Bob and sent him back. Well, Bob hasn't returned to town. He's not coming back. A new guy is back in town, right? Yeah? So return means it's got to be numerically the same, right? But there's been the space of time where the body ceased to exist. It doesn't exist anymore. And now after some time passes where it doesn't exist, here we got another one. Well, the only thing we can say is that this one is just like the previous one, but we can't say it's the same one because there's this block of time between them when there didn't exist any such body. Right? Okay. So, now this has a very interesting, leads to very interesting thoughts about time and existence. And we already have talked about the relation between time and existence when we said that God is timeless, right? And we talked about the idea of the creation of the world, right? Not entailing that there was a time before the world began. So we already have a kind of sort of idea of now conceiving and thinking of time as a specific reality, as a sort of limited reality, right? Which that means the time, a temporal being is a kind of being, and not all being is temporal. So here we're actually faced with this question of the relation between time and being, because we're being told that, you know, if we can't say that there's one being if there's a temporal gap between the two. So the time between the two in which they didn't exist means that there's two things. Yeah. Now, what Ghazali says in the name of the Falasifa here, it's interesting in this passage, right? They say, thus, unless there is something that continues to exist, there also being numerically two things that are similar but separated by time, then the meaning of the term return is not fulfilled, unless one follows the doctrine of the Mu'tazila, where it would be said, and remember when we talked about the Mu'tazila believed that when God says to a thing, be and it is, he's talking to the thing when it doesn't exist. And then when he says be, it exists. So they said there are non-existent things.
Yeah.
Okay? And so as the philosopher put it here, the Mu'tazila would say, the non-existent is a thing that is permanent. Existence being a state that occurs to it at one time, ceases for a while, and returns at another. The meaning of return would thus be fulfilled through the consideration of the continuance of non-existence, which is a pure negative, as an entity. But this would be the removal of absolute non-existence and an affirmation of an entity as being continuous until existence returns to it, which is impossible. So basically the idea is, if we took the Mu'tazila view, right, existence is a state of a thing, right? So that the thing can either exist or not exist. Yeah? As when there's a non-existent thing and God says be to it, and then it exists, right? It follows the command, right? So if we took the Mu'tazila view, it's possible then for this body to exist at one time, and then for it to not exist for a period of time, and then to exist again after, right? So that you would still have the thing in between, the thing which is not existing. It would be the same thing returning, right?
Same thing
Can you
as the
just
same
repeat
way?
that last part? It's non-existent, and then what?
Okay, so let's say we're talking about resurrection, right?
Yeah.
So if we took the Mu'tazila view,
Okay.
we could understand that existing, right? Yeah, so that here's a thing that's existing, right, in its life, your body existing now. And then it passes away and it doesn't exist for a time.
Okay.
And then when resurrection, it exists again, and it would be the exact same one, because the in-between time, the only thing about it in that in-between time was it was in a different state of non-existence. So that the same thing persisted. Just like when a person leaves a town and comes back to town. So Bob left town, and then he comes back to town. Let's just call this town Existence Town, right?
Yeah.
So we say Bob left existence. He's outside existence now. And then he returns to existence, but he's the same Bob because, right, in the state of non-existence, he was still that thing. Right? This is because the Mu'tazilites make thinghood independent of existence. And they understand existence as a kind of state or condition that occurs to a thing. Right? So that we can, actually talk about the same thing existing, then not existing, then existing again, and being the same thing throughout that.
Okay.
Or, of course, the problem that the philosopher, and probably Ghazali agrees with, this is from Ibn Sina, but Ghazali and Ash'arites agree, that this is an absurd view because, as it says, it means that there's no such thing as non-existent. Absolute non-existence is not a thing, right?
Yeah.
Everything is always existing.
Yeah.
So we actually have to talk, okay, in a certain sense, the thing exists even when it doesn't exist.
Mm.
So it somehow doesn't exist in time, or it doesn't exist in the world of the shahada, right? This world, it's sort of the phenomenal world, right? But yet it exists in an absolute sense. Yeah? Now you have two kind of levels of existence. One where everything always exists in the absolute sense.
Like a different realm.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
we
Yeah.
come into other. Yeah.
Right. So this just the sense of which it exists now or it exists later at resurrection is a kind of an issue of whether it exists in this world, or you could say whether it exists in time, because the phenomenal world is the temporal world. So if outside the temporal world everything always exists eternally, right? But non-existence is only a kind of absence from the temporal scheme, right? Absence from the temporal world. Then for a thing to cease to exist only just means that it leaves the temporal realm and then comes back again. And then that maybe at another time when resurrection would be the same thing returning again. But unless we think of it that way, we can't think of it as the same thing, right? Yeah? Okay? It's very interesting, this part, yeah?
Yeah.
So, but I think the Falasifa and Ghazali both disagree with the Mu'tazila on that, and so they're not going to take that view. They don't take that view.
It's okay, I'll do it. It's okay, I'll do it.
I think it's off. Okay.
I think it's the red switch.
The red switch?
No.
Yeah.
That's not. That's this. You do what you want. That thing doesn't work. It says obsolete. So I'll just turn the fan on. Okay. And that's, as far as my experience with those things, that's the only thing it's going to turn off again later because we turned it on. I don't think we can control the temperature. As far as I know, we can control the fan.
One question about the point we were talking about, which is the non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
They say that the non-existent is still existing.
The
Yeah,
Mu'tazila.
it's a thing which exists.
Yeah, so.
But then it comes back.
Mhm.
So then, how is it the same thing if it's coming back?
Well, it can only come back if it's the same thing, right? It just wasn't here for a while.
Yeah, if it wasn't here and then it came, something must have changed during this phase of ceasing to exist and then coming to existence.
Right, so it was removed from the
Yeah.
temporal phenomenal world. Yeah?
Yeah.
Placed back on the shelf. I don't know. It's just, yeah. It's one of those, that's a basic question that could be discussed a lot. Yeah, underlying this thing. Okay, so then we have the same problem with the second alternative, right?
Okay.
And that was the argument that you actually anticipated. I mean, right? That's what you were thinking. It can't be the same thing. That's what their argument is. Yeah, it can't be the same thing, right? Unless we have this weird view that everything exists all the time, right? And that nothing ever doesn't exist, right? So, actually, they have to take the view that nothing doesn't exist because not to exist is to not to be something. This is a very, this is a very fundamental ontological issue, which is difficult to hold in your mind clearly, right? Once you try to take one side, you find yourself slipped on the other side, and you go around in circles, right? Okay, so the second alternative is impossible for the same reason, right? Because the second alternative also proposes that the soul would be returned, that the surviving soul would be returned to the quantitatively identical body, right? Yeah. And their argument is a little bit more involved here. They say I'm sorry, we're not. We're on the second part, right? This is the view, the first alternative, but the second version. So in this first alternative, the second version, right? Nothing really ceased to exist. It's just that the matter that the body, right, consisted in changed to another form. Yeah? And this is going back to a view that it's just impossible for something to completely cease to exist. Whenever something doesn't exist, it's just the same stuff. It's permanently existing. It changes from one form to another, right? And the reason to think that it's impossible for something to cease to exist or to actually come to be is just that. What are we saying happens when that right? You think they can put it back on the shelf, or what, right? If it comes to exist, where does it come from? From non-existence, and it jumps into existence, right? And so there's this problem of change, this fundamental problem of change. And one of the ways to solve that problem of change was to say that nothing comes to exist or ceases to exist. Rather, matter is just changed from one form to another, which we find now in our physics, right? The conservation of energy law, right? The thermodynamics law. Okay. So, on this view, then, the body doesn't just come to be from having absolute not existed. Rather, God recreates the exact same body, but by bringing the same matter. Well, why is it the same body? Well, because it's the same stuff. It's the same matter, right? So if I have a clay cup and I break the cup, right, and then it breaks into little pieces of clay, I can make the cup again and it will be the same cup if it's the same clay. If I take some different clay and I make that'll be a new cup. But if I take the same clay and I put it back together, I get the same cup. Why is it the same cup? Well, because it's the same clay. Nothing ceased to exist, right? It was continuous through that period of time. It's just that stuff wasn't in the shape of a cup for a while, and I put it back into the shape of the cup. So if it's the same stuff, it's the same cup, right? Now, the philosopher argument against this is that all the material parts of the individual are cycled and exchanged through her life, right? So when we're talking about a living being, right, a body actually doesn't always just have one set of stuff or matter which it consists of throughout that time, right? You're always recycling, right? You're eating stuff and you're letting it out, right? Put it politely, yeah? And you're all the time going around and around like this, yeah? And we're basically all sharing the stuff, right? So that gives us a lot of problem, right? So that's why the identity of the person is the soul, because the body is constantly changing stuff. So there's no way that we can ever say that, it's the same individual throughout that whole lifespan on the basis of the body, because the body's never the same. It's always different stuff. But the soul is the same, and that's why you say that it's the same person, even though the body's continually being renewed and continually different.
Yeah, but what's the problem of change? Like, I'm changing all the time, but I'm still Aisha. It's not because of my soul.
Yeah, your soul is what makes it Aisha, because if it's the same, there's got to be something that's the same that doesn't change. If everything changed, then you're not going to be the same person throughout that time.
Enough?
Huh?
My existence is enough.
That's
Or
your
I have
soul,
to rely
right?
on the soul.
Well, it's got to be something that stays the same.
The state of me being alive.
So if I'm going to say that you are the same Aisha as when you were 2 years old,
Okay.
then there's got to be something that remained through that time period. If nothing remained, then everything's different. Then you're not the same person.
The form is
The form is the soul. That's what the philosopher mean by the soul.
Does it have to be the soul?
The soul is the form. I mean, the form, if you're talking about the physical form, well, the physical form's not the same.
Yeah.
Because, you were like little and lumpy and, wrinkly, but now you're big and tall. So it's different, right? Even the physical form is different.
Something cannot be a form if it's changing? Something cannot be a form if it's changing?
Change is the cycling of forms through matter, right?
Okay,
Yeah. So if it changes though, when it changes, if it still exists, then the form which makes it what it is has to remain. Only the accidental form can change, right? So if I, for example, paint my car a different color, it's changed, but the accidental form has changed, not the form of carness, which makes it that car.
Okay, so what makes me Aisha is my soul?
Yeah, so what makes you a human is supposed to be your, rational animality, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So now this was an interesting problem, the question about the individuality of the human soul. We discussed this, I think, before. If there's an individual in, a human soul, distinct from the body, that caused some problem for Aristotelian philosophy, because the soul for Aristotle was the form, humanness, right? And so therefore there wouldn't be any individual souls. There's no such thing as individual identity in that case, because, right? the humanity is universal to all humans.
Yeah.
So therefore, Ibn Rushd concludes that everybody only has really one soul. We each don't have our own soul. All humanity has one single soul, which is just the humanness that we share, right? Individuality only comes from matter and the body. Now the problem with that, though, is that the body, as we see, is always constantly changing and cycling. So there's really not even any personal identity that you can connect to the body that remains over time, right? The question here is, what is this personal identity that we intuitively understand, right, and that we think, right, it remains over time? Yeah, we can't really find it in the traditional Aristotelian notion of the form, and we can't find it in the body because the body is constantly changing, right?
Okay.
And that's why you have Ibn Sina doing this introspective thing when he talks about the flying man, and if God created a human being with his senses sealed, would he know his own existence? So that the awareness of yourself as an individual,
Yeah.
so I mean, is a sort of introspective and self-evident datum, right, which establishes your individuality, yourself. That's a new kind of concept of soul, right? And then he goes and wants to argue then to the immaterial individual soul, yeah. And that would solve the problem, right? Your soul is immaterial and individual; it's independent of the body, yeah. So what am I saying here? Okay, why did we get into that? How does this link back up to? It's definitely related. We need to know what we're talking about when we talk about the soul. Okay. Does it answer your question? You are your soul. Yeah?
So if I don't believe in a soul, خلاص?
Well, if you don't believe in the soul, then yeah, you have to figure out what your personal identity, or maybe there's no such thing as personal identity. You know, maybe it's kind of an illusion or something that we kind of construct. It's a social construct or something. But who are we that's constructing it? I mean, that's the difficult thing too. It's hard to think something like Nietzsche. Nietzsche had this to say, you know, yourself is a kind of a fabrication that you yourself come up with. You know, I was like, well, who is coming up with a fabrication? You tell me that my personal identity as a self, right, is just a fabrication that I concoct in order to sort of make sense of things and to meet certain needs I have. That's what Nietzsche says. But I'm always asking, well, what's the I? Who's the me that's having the needs and concocting this fabrication if it's not something that exists? So the whole thing is very paradoxical to me, that idea.
Yeah.
You know? But on this view, there's a soul, and that's what makes you who you are, and it's returned to, the philosopher don't believe it can be returned to the same body. And the reason is for that, right? There's not enough, basically, matter to go around, right? Matter has been cycled through the body all the time, so you can't really collect. Well, they say you have to choose. Is it the matter which the body had exactly at that moment when it died? So
Yeah.
if they go collect that matter, then you'd end up with, whatever state or condition the body was in at that time. Maybe he was diseased, or he was emaciated, you were old, or maybe, I had an amputation. Then I'll be all messed up when I'm resurrected. And now, what kind of a paradise is that when my body's all like crappy like it is now?
But
Yeah.
they say in heaven God restores what you've lost before dying.
So you want a good, nice body, right?
Yeah.
So that's not a good option. Maybe the other, that's not really coherent to think. So maybe all the matter that the body was ever cycled through the body is collected by God, right? But if we say that, then obviously we don't have enough matter to go around because all of this matter was shared between all these bodies, right? To compound that, the philosopher believes that there's an infinite number of souls because they believe that the world is eternal and that the species were eternal, so that there's always been human beings giving birth to new human beings. So we would have a finite amount of matter, an infinite number of souls, and we wouldn't be able to, right, distribute the matter necessary for all the different bodies because there's a limited amount of matter. Yeah? So that's that problem. Yeah? And we don't have, the other problem is that we don't have enough time to cover everything. So, but,
Okay. We can finish this up on Thursday.
yeah, we'll finish it up on Thursday. Yeah. Hopefully you'll